Welcome back to the Evolving Warfighter. My name is Dr. Franklin Annis, and today I'm excited to announce a new video series called Forgotten Lore. While on my channel I primarily focus on self-development techniques and approaches, in this video series I'm going to talk about some reading materials that I found particularly interesting and have impacted my own self-development. Today's video comes from the period of the Great War, or World War I. This is a great period in military history and I enjoy studying it, primarily because this is the first war that we see the major technological advancements come to play in combination with the Industrial Revolution. I believe studying the First World War is incredibly important because today when we face problems on the modern battlefield, they have gotten incredibly complex and incredibly fast in terms of speeds that we encounter. However, a lot of these problems originated during the First World War. And if we go back in time and look at the problems, maybe when the machinery wasn't as fast or as complex, we may have some insights of solving the problem when the speed of warfare was slower that could still be applied today that we may not have thought of. It is also interesting just to look at how these individuals tried to adapt to incredibly shifting changes in military technology. The book I'll use to begin this series is a book written by Frederick Talbot, Airplanes and Dirigibles of War. It was published in 1915. Given the fact that it was published so early, it captures an interesting aspect of the evolution of aviation warfare during the first couple years of the Great War. Many of the major advancements in aviation warfare actually come after the publishing of the book. But if we read the context of the books, you can capture a spirit of evolution. Even the author said the capabilities of aviation on the battlefield were really only half revealed. I'm going to take a moment to talk about the author, Frederick Talbot. He has an interesting backstory as he was born into English aristocracy and would have become an earl. However, he turned down the position, wanting to get out and explore the world. He became a war correspondent during the Boers War, making him a contemporary of Winston Churchill. Another famous author and friend, Rudyard Kipling, is the one that actually suggested that he should consider writing books. There are dozens of themes within this book that are worthy of review. However, to keep this video to a manageable length, I've decided to focus on these 6. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin must have been a remarkable man in terms of both character and passion to get his rigid-framed aircraft built. The military value of these machines is in question of whether or not it was proportional to the cost, because as you can see from the images behind me, it seemed destined that all his aircraft would end up destroyed. Whether it be by enemy fire or the sheer act of nature itself, Zeppelins were prone to either crashing or being shot out of the sky. While early on in the war they did have some distinct advantages. One of the main advantages was they were able to gain altitude at an extremely fast rate, outpacing any aircraft that came near. Also early on in the war they were able to maintain an altitude that was unreachable by aircraft, essentially making them invulnerable to hostile action. However, they were always prone to the negative impacts of weather. It's interesting that the author brings up the point that the Germans had developed a non-exploding gas, but dismisses this theory for nothing more than propaganda. While the gas that we now know today as helium was invented by the Germans at the time, they were never able to sufficiently make it in such quantity to use it in the military applications. Therefore, they continued to use the highly flammable hydrogen gas to fill both their balloons and their dirigibles. The Zeppelin did have some interesting applications as a bomber because it was able to lift a heavy load. If we use the analogy of a modern hot air balloon that drops ballast or a sandbag to raise in height, the same thing would occur on a dirigible if it dropped its bomb load. While the dirigible could carry mass amounts of bombs, it only could drop a certain proportion of that while gaining altitude. If it dropped the whole total weight of its cargo all at once, the dirigible would ascend at such a rate that it would be uncontrollable by the pilot and then likely lead to a crash. While the Zeppelins could carry a significant bomb load, they could only drop a few hundred pounds of bombs at any given time. The author brings up another interesting note that these Zeppelins often navigated and identified their targets at night by the sounds of the city below. While Zeppelins did pull off a number of successful bombing attacks, these attacks had more psychological value than they did tactical value in terms of the damage that was done. Both the Navy and the field artillery were quick to realize the value of aerial observation. A Navy mosquito boat on patrol typically has a visual range about 8 miles forward of their position. However, an aircraft at 1,000 feet above the water has a visible range of about 40 miles. That's 5 times the range. Using an aircraft, whether it was an airplane or a dirigible, to scout the forward seas allowed navies to determine whether they were capable of engaging the enemy that was approaching them, or to determine the best formation to place their fleet to engage the enemy. Aerial observation drastically increased the usefulness of field artillery, especially when we talk about trench warfare and the target starting being below the level of the earth. It may not have been possible for a forward observer sitting in one trench to observe whether the artillery strikes were occurring before in the enemy trench or after the enemy trench. By raising an observer in a balloon, they could determine whether or not they were hitting in the trench. Later, when they adapted the use of aircraft, aircraft could fly over trenches and tell them whether or not the trench was occupied to save them ammunition. Additionally, the aircraft could fly over enemy trenches and direct fire. There's a very interesting technique where pilots could pre-coordinate with artillery batteries about what altitude they'd fly over enemy trenches. If they saw a worthy target below, they would drop either tinsel or smoke. Through the use of trigonometry, artillerymen could determine the range to the target because they already knew the predetermined altitude of the pilot, and all they had to do is observe the angle to which they saw the plane. It is quite remarkable to imagine the job of the very first aviation reconnaissance missions. These pilots had the very challenging mission of keeping an aircraft in the air that was rather primitive that it needed its constant attention. Additionally, they had to be good with maps to determine where they were going. They had to be quick at taking notes. They had to have excellent eyesight to observe what's below them. Plus, they had to be attentive to where on the battlefield they were at any given time and return home safely. 2 forms of aerial reconnaissance developed over time. There was a quick operational reconnaissance in which a pilot was assigned a certain stretch of the forward trench line. The pilot would take off, observe the trench immediately and pose to a regimental commander's position, do a quick reconnaissance and return as fast as possible to relay that message, at which time the regimental commander could quickly shift his forces to take instant advantage of the current situation on the battlefield. Additionally, there was a much longer reconnoitering process where pilots were sent up given a large area to cover, and they would spend as much time in the air as needed to do a proper reconnaissance. They would fly as much as 20 miles into enemy territory to observe all the enemy actions. They'd be observing for where new trenches were being dug or any type of troop movement that was going on. This information would be brought back and given to higher level headquarters to allow for strategic level planning. It is interesting to note that as aerial reconnaissance advanced, so did disguises to full aerial reconnaissance. In many cases, false trenches were dug. There was great effort to hide men inside trenches when aircraft were flown over. While the first reconnaissance missions probably used little more than a map and a notepad to take notes, the military was quick to adapt the technology of photographs. Aerial photos could be examined in great detail to determine any type of valuable intelligence. I'll end this section on a couple points that I found really interesting. The first was rather comical and something that I didn't think about until I read this book. If you have an observation balloon, it's very rare that it stays directly over the mooring, as in the fact that it's affected by the wind. So as the wind blows, the balloon will go one way to the other. Well, if the mooring line is actually attached to the basket and the wind is significant enough, the balloon can tip to a 45-degree angle or more, and it can tip to a point where the actual observer or soldier in the basket can fall out. Wow. While this sounds like a funny note, I'd sure hate to be that guy if it happened. The other note that I found particularly interesting is the author provides a way of determining range to shoot down observation balloons with artillery pieces. I won't talk about it in detail, but I do believe it may be a technique that we could use today against unmanned aerial vehicles, so I encourage all the soldiers out there to take a look. One of the most interesting chapters in aviation history is the steps taken to arm aircraft. How do you arm aircraft to allow them to do combat with other aircraft? The author said this first began by arming pilots with self-loading pistols, such as the Mauser C-96 at the time. At the time of writing this book, the synchronization gear to safely shoot machine guns through the propeller of an aircraft without bullets striking the prop of the plane had yet to be invented. But shortly after this book came out, that device was created and had a dramatic impact on the battlefield. During the time that this book was published, pilots often had the difficulty of firing and aiming machine guns that they couldn't aim directly down the barrels of. For example, machine guns are sometimes mounted above the forward wing of the aircraft. While the pilot could point the nose of his aircraft at the enemy aircraft he was trying to do a duel with, that didn't necessarily aim the machine gun fire on top of that aircraft. The author does spend some time talking about the best positions to have aviation duels and the benefits of arming both the front and the rear of an aircraft. He reports that an upper level position provides the best advantage because it's more simple to aim a weapon down than try to aim a weapon up when you're in a dogfight. We also need to remember that during this time period, sometimes pilots were asked to try to engage other pilots while still controlling their vehicle. Now you could imagine the difficulty of trying to do this with a rifle, keeping your hands on the control, but yet trying to fire in an upward position. For this reason, a higher level position than your opponent was always preferred because it was easier to maintain control of your vehicle and yet aim a weapon downwards. It's really interesting to see the evolution of armaments being attached to aircraft and what type of tactics that created as a result. Given the difficulty to determine the range of the enemy aircraft and the impact of windage, machine guns became the king of aerial combat, simply because it just put more lead into the air. However, we also must realize that the aerial combatants understood that they were not alone in the sky. They did not simply just spray their machine guns and hope they hit the enemy target, as they were often flying over their own trenches. So pilots had to be well disciplined in the use of their machine gun fire to prevent any unneeded friendly casualties. For this reason, most pilots engaged at a distance less than 300 meters away from the enemy to ensure that they are actually hitting their targets and could be economic with the amount of machine gun ammunition they expended. The author also takes some time to explain where on the enemy aircraft it would be best suited to shoot and engage. It was identified that there are several different weak points in the aircraft that would cause it to crash. While the author brings up the point that the sparrings in the wings are incredibly fragile and theoretically a valuable target, it was actually the engine of the enemy aircraft that most aviators aimed for. For this reason, aviators used armor-piercing ammunition because when they engaged the enemy, they wanted to ensure that they were doing mechanical damage when striking the engine of their opponent. The author admits that there is a likely outcome when your engine being struck with armor-piercing rounds that your aircraft may plummet to the ground and you die in the process. While it was possible to essentially turn your aircraft into a glider if you had engine problems, this was not always the case. So he admits that even in 1915 it was noted that the pilot of the other aircraft was a preferred target that you could aim at to destroy. So you can see here that the mythology between the Knights of the Air, men doing combat just to shoot down each other's aircraft but not kill each other in terms of the pilots themselves, have already disappeared really early on in the war. Shortly after the publishing of the book, the Germans created a safe way of firing their machine guns directly through the props of their aircraft. Soon after, other countries were able to adapt this type of technology, which revolutionized aviation warfare. Talbot made a great point that all aviation warfare is a game of no quarter. There's never been a technique developed to tow an enemy aircraft that somehow surrendered to you in air. So all aviation warfare is really a game where you fight to the death, where you make a desperate attempt to run back to the safety of your home airfield. While aviators of this period lived lives with much more luxury and fame than the typical infantrymen in the trenches, nonetheless risked the same death on the battlefield. With all the risks these aviators were taking in the air, it should come as really no surprise that they took the maximum amount of advantage to the luxuries they had when available. They greatly enjoyed the fame of becoming an ace and enjoyed the notoriety for as long as it lasted. I often wonder if the death heads and Grim Reaper characters that were painted outside their aircraft were as much an acceptance of the deadly risks of the games they were playing as they were symbols to frighten the enemy. By the end of World War I, more than 50,000 airmen lost their lives. Bombing from aircraft started by dropping metal darts. These metal darts used the force of gravity to gain velocity. By the time they fell over thousands of feet, they gained enough energy to be capable of killing an individual. While these darts were used by various different armies in the conflict, they were noted to lack the accuracy to really do damage to soldiers, even when they targeted the formation of soldiers. However, the author points out that these darts were rather effective if you used them to target horses in the logistical trains. These darts caused enough panic and chaos in the horses that the horses would cause significant damage. Later, aviators took up common explosives such as hand grenades up into their aircraft to drop on enemy trenches. This caused the creation of larger and larger bombs to be created in an attempt to cause more and more damage. Typically, these bombs were stored inside the passenger compartment and had to be lifted up outside of the passenger compartment over the side of the aircraft manually. This is when aviators started to realize that the forward inertia of the plane was imparted on the bomb when the bomb was released. For example, if the aircraft was moving forward at 60 miles an hour, when the bomb was dropped, it did not fall directly below the aircraft, but it continued forward slightly as it used up the energy. So it required a lot of practice to get good at the art of bombing, especially considering that the forward momentum of the bomb varied with the altitude of the aircraft. Additionally, the wind was sometimes powerful enough to blow the bomb backwards from that forward momentum. It is also during this period of time that they realized the shape of the bomb mattered. The original bombs dropped by Zeppelins were a large bullet shape, but by the end of the war you see an evolution of what we think of as wars in the Second World War period. Very much pear-shaped and with stabilizing fins to ensure that they hit nose first to increase the effective fragmentation of the bomb itself. While various armies experimented with bombs during the war, we have to note that this practice was really in its infancy, as most of the effects of bombing was more psychological than it was for a tactical advantage. One of the most interesting things that the author records is the use of damaged aircraft as what we'd call now vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. Aircrafts that were damaged in concept or not considered safe or airworthy had their engines removed. The aircraft was then filled with explosives and a timer. The controls were set to allow the plane to act like a glider. Another plane would pull this glider into the air. It would be pointed towards the enemy trench and released. If everything worked correctly, this glider would explode over an enemy trench and rain down deadly shrapnel. This tactic had another interesting tactical feature, for if an enemy aircraft saw this glider heading towards the trenches and perceived it as a live aircraft and decided to engage, they would reveal their position, and fighters at a much higher altitude could then descend and attack the enemy fighter. The worst case scenario is the enemy fighter would shoot down the glider and the glider would simply land in enemy territory and explode on the ground sooner than expected. Anyone that studied military history understands that logistics is a big part of war. The German government seemed to have understood this concept when it applied to the aviation warfare. They purchased about 4 to 5 different types of aircraft at one time. This allowed for standardization of maintenance parts, of pilot training, etc. On the other hand, the French military had been collecting different types of aircraft from dozens of different private manufacturers for years prior to the war. Early on during the war, France went through their aircraft and determined only a small number of them suitable for combat. A list of suitable aircraft was published in France. As a result, 558 aircraft were removed from service. Unfortunately, this resulted in having a surplus of over 400 trained pilots that didn't have machines to fly. It was really unclear why the French government didn't decide to use these aircraft until they were deemed unserviceable in terms of mechanical failures until replacement aircraft that were standardized could be acquired. In France's drive to be more logistically sustainable, they seemed to compromise their air power. The British military, on the other hand, seemed to do the opposite. They're turning out as many aircraft as possible through their government manufacturing facilities, but would also accept civilian-made aircraft due to the extreme shortage of aircraft for British pilots. As I said earlier, there are literally dozens of topics that this book covers, and I merely scratched the surface with this video. I invite you to take a look at this book and read it for yourself. Here are some links that you may find helpful. The first one is for LibriVox.org, where you can find an audiobook of this recording. The full recording takes less than 7 hours to listen to. The next link is from archive.org, and it gives a scanned copy of this book. Overall, I found this book incredibly insightful in terms of giving a glimpse of the very first evolutions of a new military technology on the battlefield. I believe Talbot gives a very interesting mix of just enough technical data to provide the audience background about what's going on, but not so much technical data that it becomes boring or overwhelming in terms of studying it as a novice. I'd encourage anyone interested in World War I history to take a look, or anyone interested in aviation history to take a look at those beginning days of warfare. Thank you for watching this video, and I invite you to subscribe to the Evolving Warfighter for more videos on the topic of military self-development. Until next time, I encourage you to focus on your self-development so we can ensure that we can dominate the modern battlefield.